Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the City of Bellingham Transportation Benefit District Board meeting of June 1st. We'll start with roll call.
Chuck Weiss.
Here.
Gene Knutson.
Here.
Daniel Hamill.
Here.
Pinky Vargas.
Here.
Terry Borneman.
Here.
Michael Lillquist.
Here.
Roxanne Murphy.
Here.
Okay, thank you. We've got 5 items. We're going to go out of order, out of the request of the staff. We're going to go for item 4 first, the interlocal agreement for Bellis Fair transit stop improvements.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Ted Carlson, Public Works Department. This is a project that the board had approved previously. The action before the board today is the interlocal agreement between the City of Bellingham and WTA. We put a graphic up on here to remind the board what we're talking about. This relates to bus stop improvements at the Bellis Fair Parkway. It is a safety project and certainly improves the way this area functions and increases safety for transit users and pedestrians. The total project cost is estimated to be approximately $450,000. The TBD board approved the use of TBD funding up to half that project amount, or $225,000, whichever is less. And so that's what's reflected in the interlocal agreement before the board today. WTA staff is here to answer any questions you may have about the project. WTA is the lead on this project. They will be the project manager contracting for the work, and the TBD is simply a funding partner on this project. So this was included in the budget. Like I said, it was this is reflective of previous board direction, and we're just looking for authorization to enter into the interlocal agreement.
Just a quick question for me. I hardly ever go out there. Exactly where is this?
Mike, do you want to come up and walk the board
I
through
know
this?
you've told us before, but...
Sure. So this is related to some changes actually that were made by the state on Meridian a few years ago, access control. That's changed the flow of traffic out there. Mike can kind of walk through it.
Yeah,
Okay.
It's on Bellis Fair Parkway, and I got another view. You can see this is Bellis Fair Parkway going north-south, tying in on the right to the Guide Meridian. So the mall is to the bottom of this page. Let's see.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I guess
Okay.
That's the only one.
Michael.
What is the ramp feature across the street?
Oh, that's an existing feature that was
Okay.
installed by the hotel that's going in next door. Not part of this project.
Any other questions? Jack?
Approve the interlocal agreement. Move to approve.
Second.
Motion been made and seconded. Discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries 7-0. Thank you. Now we'll go to item 1.
Good afternoon, Matt Stamps, City Attorney's Office. I'm filling in for Peter Rufato today and was going to introduce this item very briefly and then pass it over to Brian Henshaw to discuss some of the financing issues. This is this agenda item is a first extension of a funding interlocal with WTA. And just a little bit on the terminology there. It's labeled as a first extension, as you probably are all familiar with. The original agreement was entered into in 2011. It was roughly a one-year first term, with then 4 annual renewals followed. And then that original agreement provided for a extension at the end of that 5 years, basically. Another 5-year extension, presumably with 1-year renewals after that first year. Same structure. The way this is drafted here is just a 1-year extension, and the thought was that there's been discussion on the board about reduced funding over time, so that the thought here was that a 1-year extension might be more appropriate. This item is going to call for an affirmative vote from the board, but before doing that, there's some discussion and direction needed on Attachment A, which addresses the funding options. At this point, I turn over to Brian to discuss those. That's page 5 of your packet, I believe.
Yeah, thanks. Brian Henshaw, City of Bellingham Finance Department, and then on behalf of the TBD Board Secretary and Treasurer. So today you have in your packet page 5 and page 6. Page 6 is the WTA proposal of their board, and through their general manager, Peter Stark, back to the TBD board for the funding proposal. We went back and reviewed what your original intent was, or the motion that you made before on the 2/3 funding. And so really what we need to do is just clarify, Jack, it was your motion and what the intent was there. Page 5 in your packet basically has it calculated two ways. The first one, the top one, is just the estimated, taking all of the WTA services that we've contracted with and then taking 2/3 of that for the funding level in 2016. And then the second one, the bottom one on that page, is what their proposal basically back to you is, which is slightly different calculation or interpretation of that. And you have the letter there, and Roxanne and Jack and the mayor, I believe, were at that board meeting, and so you might be available to answer any questions. But basically on this one, it's 2/3 of the Sunday service, because that's what was originally added on by the TBD board. But in addition to that, it's 100% of the services for the extended routes and hours that the TBD board added that wasn't necessarily a part of the WTA's original proposal. So I've just calculated it both ways. You can see the difference of the numbers on how you've calculated it, but it's really up to the TBD board now to say what that number will be. And the last thing I'll just say is that both of these are predicated on estimated hours and rates for next year. None of it is a firm number. And the way we've done this in the past is at the end of each year, we reconcile to their actual number. And then so far, we've received a credit each year from WTA for the balance or the difference between their estimate and what the actual hours turn out to be. So I'll turn it back over to you to discuss what the original intent was and what you'd like us to do.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Yeah, when we were first talking about it, the history of this was that we would supply funding from the TBD. This was one of the campaign promises, actually, was that we would supply funding to the TBD, from the TBD to WTA for restoration of Sunday service. When I made the motion, it was fairly clear in my mind, although I'd never really expressed it verbally, that this was to reduce the Sunday service component of our TBD contribution. The other line, the other service requests that we have contracted with WTA in the past, those are for new services. This is something that wasn't part of the reduction that happened a few years ago. This was for new service, and I think out of fairness, it would be unfair for us to go and expect WTA to go and fund that on an ongoing basis without going through the strategic planning process that they're doing this year. What I would encourage us to do is to accept the second approach that's on the page, and to have the 1/3 reduction apply only to Sunday service, and to have 100% continued funding for the balance of the services that we have.
Roxanne?
I'm right there with Jack. I wish you all could have been at the meetings that we have held with the WTA, because this was a bit of a knockout and a drag out, because the small cities were disappointed with this as the fellow board members on WTA, and we really had to defend the city's honor in this budget allocation. So that's why taking this approach, I feel like, is the best one to ease us into this change. So I hope you'll consider supporting it.
Was that a motion?
So I move to accept the extension that we have presented to us, or the modification of the first extension, with provision of the second box on page 5.
I'll second that.
Motion been made and seconded. Discussion. Dan?
Just curious as to the effect to Sunday service, what that would mean.
Well, assuming that WTA next year, through its budget process that will happen later on this year, will supply the necessary funding for the 1/3 component that we're reducing as a TBD board, there would be no effect on Sunday service.
Sure.
Just want to clarify the rate. There's two rates that are listed here, a rate of 162 and then 127. I'm just trying to understand what that rate, the 162, is referred to.
So that's the estimated rate based on WTA's estimate for the 2016 budget, and it's early in that process, so they're subject to revision. But the second one there is for paratransit service, which is a requirement that we provide that for all the hours that they provide the regular routes. And so does that answer your question on just the hourly rates?
So 162 covers the cost of the drivers and the buses that are out, and how many routes does that cover?
Rick, come on up.
The Sunday service that the City of Bellingham, the TBD, is purchasing is 9 separate buses on Sunday. And so just for maybe for your background, the Sunday service that WTA cut in 2010 was 10 buses. The city chose to buy back 9 of those, and then a couple years later extended onto that the hours of service, an extra hour in the morning and an extra hour in the evening. So the Sunday service that Bellingham enjoys now doesn't look quite the same as what WTA cut in 2010.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Any other questions before we vote? Michael?
I'm not sure if we're voting on this yet, but going back to the 162 and 127, as you say, those numbers are adjusted every year. This isn't the final locked-in-stone number. Are those numbers creeping upward, staying flat, going down in general? How are those budget rate numbers going?
They've gone up approximately like CPI, or 3% a year, I would say, just since the beginning. We basically do an estimate and then it's a revision. So I can tell you last year what the total contract amount came to was $1,346,000. So that was after we had received our credit. So the hourly rate is just a placeholder until all of that calculation is done. So I would ask one other point, Jack, on the clarification. So in that second box, it does include the paratransit also at the 2/3 amount, just to be perfectly clear as we
That's
go forward.
perfectly clear, yes.
Perfectly.
Thank you. And that is an estimated amount. So we had one final revision from WTA, and that 1088 number there actually is now 1091, which will be reflected in the final documents. But again, it's just an estimate, and there will be a credit based on the actual. And that could be a higher or lower amount. It doesn't necessarily guarantee it'll be lower, but we true it up at the end of the year based on actual hours and their rate.
Okay. Jack?
Just one question maybe of Rick.
Come on back up, Rick. Where is he? He's hiding. You can't hide, Rick.
Do you see the proportional paratransit service on Sunday different than you would on the other 6 days for a service area of approximately that size?
Could you repeat the question, please?
So with paratransit on Sunday, is that a higher proportional rate of utilization than it would be for the other 6 days in the same service area?
Based on ridership, you mean?
Yeah.
That's a good question. My gut reaction is, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. I think it's probably lower because there's a lot fewer seniors going to doctor's appointments and that type of thing. So my gut would tell me it's lower, but I don't have exact numbers on that.
Yeah, I was thinking doctor's appointments versus church, you know.
Yeah, church is a relatively small part of that on Sunday.
Okay.
Dan? Can you describe what the paratransit services cover?
What does it cover? So paratransit service is the federally mandated service that the Americans with Disability Act requires all transit properties to provide that mirror the area and the times that the big fixed route buses are operating. So anytime we add service to a new area or to an existing area but a new time, earlier or later, we also, by law, are required to expand our paratransit service for seniors and people with disabilities by that same degree.
So would that be the specialized transportation where the person would call ahead and then the smaller bus would come to the facility or the house?
Exactly right.
Thank you.
Okay. All those in favor of the motion will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. We'll now go to item number 2, discussion of transit reserve funding.
So sticking with the one-third, one-third, one-third concept, where one-third of the TBD funding goes to the arterial resurfacing, one-third goes to non-motorized, and one-third goes to transit. We've always had a transit reserve, and that's any money that's remaining each year after the enhanced service contract is paid for. So after the services are paid for that Brian just talked about, there'll be some balance of the one-third, which is generally 1.5 million or something in that ballpark, depending on sales tax. And the discussion is, where do we apply that money? And you just earlier approved the bus stop improvements at Bellis Fair. So that's one of the things we've done in the past. We've applied that transit portion of the TBD to infrastructure projects like the bus stops. A few years ago, we made some intersection improvements at Alabama and Woburn that served transit, allowed them to make a movement easier and help them in terms of keeping their routes on time. And in your packet is a resolution from the Transportation Commission. And recently, when we went to the Transportation Commission with the 6-year TIP, which you'll be hearing tonight, Transportation Improvement Program, in their adopting resolution or their recommendation to the council, they made a statement about where they would like to see that transit reserve applied. And what they talked about is applying the transit reserve to quiet zones and helping to fund quiet zones, which is a project on the 6-year TIP. It's listed in the out years because it's not funded. And when we talk about the 6-year TIP, the list, you'll see the list of projects. They're really not prioritized, meaning one's the most important and the final project is the least important. They're really only prioritized in one way. To be in the first 3 years of the TIP, they need to be fully funded. If they're not fully funded, you see them in the out 3 years of the TIP, and that's a requirement of RCW. So what we wanted to get from the board today was direction on how you would like to see the transit reserve used. And a couple options, certainly the option recommended by the Transportation Commission. It could be applied to another project on the 6-year TIP. Or we could do as we've done in the past and what the WTA board has requested, that transit reserve be applied to infrastructure, to capital projects that serve transit. And in fact, the WTA board, in a letter from Pete Stark to the city, had recommended that that be identified in the interlocal agreement between the city and WTA, that any remaining transit money would be applied to infrastructure to serve transit, and that we would develop some criteria to decide which projects should be funded. That wasn't in the interlocal agreement before you today. That would take a modification to the agreement, but what I was hoping to get was some direction from the board. Should that transit reserve money be applied to other projects on the TIP, like the quiet zone as recommended by the TC, or should it stay and be funded and fund transit-related projects, either infrastructure or service contracts? And we've talked about this over the years, and it's been applied in various ways at the TBD board's direction. And so I wanted to just have a discussion with you, perhaps get some direction. We could come back with an update to the interlocal agreement with WTA if that's the direction, or modify the TIP as we move forward if that's the direction. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. We could certainly bring Pete up here and relay maybe what the WTA board directed.
Michael.
Do we have, I don't think I really have the numbers before me about the transit reserve. What I have is the draft TIP, where it mentions a transit reserve of $580,000 carried up previous budgets up through 2015. 633 would be the total in 2016. And then the out year beyond that, 2017, the transit reserve is kind of not an accurate number. It's 1.6 million, but that means
The contract
they haven't taken WTA
Right.
service out of it, so it's all reserve and no, so that number doesn't count. Are those the accurate numbers we're talking about?
Well, I think they're as accurate as we have at this point. As Brian mentioned, the interlocal you just approved us entering into with WTA, I think Brian said the number was $1,090,000, something like that, for the services. So the balance being near that 500,000 mark for 16. Brian, is that?
Come on, you might as well stay there, Brian. Nope, you guys keep jumping around.
I think it's going to be in that ballpark. It's going to depend on how much we spend. I mean, and obviously, we're going to budget a number. And Brian, if you want to.
But I want to be clear that 580 doesn't increase to 633. 580 is added to 633. Both, it isn't an increase of 50,000, it's increased of 633,000.
Annually, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So there is approximately, through end of 2016, it looks like 1.2 million that would be accumulated in the reserves. And the TC is recommending we shift about half of that to another purpose. Is that accurate?
I think moving forward, I think assume 15, there's the 2015 money, and Brian, correct me,
Yeah,
is being applied to current projects. I think you need to look at it as moving forward. So 2016 will have money available, given this current relationship with WTA, of nearly 500,000 or approximately 500,000.
I think I'm trying to figure out how much reserve is actually available. If we wanted to shift 100% of it or none of it, how much is there? The TC is asking for a shift that totals, I believe, 650,000.
Yeah, so I agree with what Ted just said. We have basically spent through 2015 approximately one-third, one-third, one-third. So really this proposal or request would be going forward in next year with the reduction that was just voted on. It would be the difference between whatever we take in on sales tax and the actual contract amount. So let's use $500,000 for example. And then it would carry through the remainder of the TBD program. I guess my thought on this would be is that we don't necessarily have to agree on this today. Throughout the budget process, you guys can prioritize projects and maybe get requests from WTA that would identify specific requests, just like the one that you approved today, and then we could make that decision in context with all of the other requirements. But there's certainly no shortage of needs, both in the non-motorized and the paving projects that are already identified, rather than expanding that into, to include another request today. The numbers, it's a little difficult because we have work in process, what we've actually spent, and then what you've committed to, and it's not a hard and fast number. So the best estimate that I can give you is $500,000 for the remainder if what we just approved continues through the end of the TBD. But that isn't even a given at this point. This is a one-year agreement, so really all you have to deal with today is $500,000 in 2016, and then everything will be up to your guys' approval again. So I think it's a little premature to even talk about projects personally, but that's really
Terry.
Well, I don't think it's premature. Having attended some of the quiet zone meetings and seeing the kind of support that seems to be out there for it, I'm in favor of supporting the Transportation Commission's recommendations. So I just throw my 2 cents out there.
Okay, and Jack will raise you 25 cents. Go ahead.
Yeah, 2 bits now. To me, it seems like, well, first of all, the Quiet Zone project is just, this is like the first time that we're really taking a first cut at it, funding-wise. I mean, we've known about it for a while, but for funding-wise, just to even put it into the tip. But we have a lot of unfunded parts of that, and it looks like even though, what is even in the tip is only a partial component of what it would take to go and establish a quiet zone citywide. And a question I had later on tonight when we have the public hearing would be, just exactly what's the scope of this quiet zone project? Is it citywide? Is it just 3? And if it's 3, is it where it hasn't been quiet about this issue, which is on the south side, or is it citywide? Those are kind of questions I'd like to understand, because if it's, if we're finding out, like what you were saying, Ted, that this project for Quiet Zone is more on the order of like $5 or $6 million to do the entire city, but we're only doing $1.5 million, and we think we can go and carve that out of the transit part of it. I'm a little bit more nervous about doing something like that. To me, it seems like it's kind of premature for us to go and make those types of commitments. It would be nice to know what the overall strategic plan of WTA is first, and that's going to take about a year to get that finally approved, and to understand what the service components are, because we may want to depending on what is approved by WTA, we may want to go and have additional services that would use that transit portion of it, and then it would compete against the quiet zone money, and then we have a problem there. We may have some capital projects that are going to be very apparent based on the strategic plan. Maybe they want to go and put a GO line, through Meridian or something up to the mall, and we don't have enough bus stops. And maybe what we could do is provide both the bus stops or the curb cuts or whatever else is necessary in order to make that GO line work or future GO line work. We might want to have a downtown circulator, which probably may or may not be funded out of WTA. A lot of that stuff is really unknown right now, and to me it seems like it's good to have the discussion about it, but I would feel uncomfortable about making a formal commitment that we would go that route. I'm very supportive of the quiet zones, and I think that we should go pursue that, but I'm a little nervous about using transit money that we have previously dedicated to that for that purpose.
Anybody else? I agree with that. We can have this Roxanne, excuse me.
I'm also with Jack on this. It would be ideal if we had a total dollar amount of what the Quiet Zone project is going to include, so we could figure out what piece of the pie we could carve out. I'd rather make a decision at that point when we have a better financial understanding, especially considering transportation benefit district dollars, when we know what the transportation infrastructure needs are. Those are known needs. Those are fully vetted projects and dollars. So I hope we can go that way.
Michael.
Well, Terry, the mayor, and I were at a meeting just a couple of days ago on the quiet zones, and Ted, you can speak to this more clearly. There's no one price yet for the quiet zones. For each crossing, there's different levels of thoroughness that you can undertake to meet the federal requirements for safety. So yeah, we don't know that exact number yet. We don't know what number we'll be comfortable with, even if we had the money. And then, as Jack says, there are other transit projects that may be higher priority, or maybe they're lower priorities. I was kind of like, for a flash moment there, really excited. What? We have a little bit of money for the quiet zones to get that rolling? That'd be really nice and exciting, but I don't think we know enough yet, and I don't have a firm enough grasp of the numbers that might be available in the TBD reserve. It's an idea I think I'd like to continue talking about, but I'm not willing to accept the TC's, Transportation Commission's recommendation today. I think that's the same you were saying.
Anybody else? Jack?
I would like to, even though I'm on WTA board, what I think from the TBD, what we would like to do maybe is to ask through the strategic plan process that WTA is currently doing. There's going to be obviously a lot of operating issues that are going to be resolved and finding out exactly how the routes are going to be, but through that process, if we could find out, what are capital costs that could support whatever, WTA is overall pursuing during the course of this one-year review of the strategic plan. Okay. And then to come back to DBD at the time with a list and say, here they are, here's how they're prioritized, and how we could help them be able to accomplish, a mission citywide.
Okay, anything else on this issue? Terry, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess in response to yours, Jack, that all sounds good, but I don't want us to get into a position where Whatcom Transit Board, which we only have a couple members, are looking at this board as the cash cow to fund things that it should be funded through Whatcom Transit as a whole. And by saying, yeah, give us a list of things, that means it might mean they're not going to look at that in part of their regular budget on things that they would ordinarily fund for other cities in other areas. And so I've got some real concerns. That was one of the original concerns. We came forward with this because there were cuts, and we were going to do that, to cover that. But, I am nervous about, we're way outnumbered in terms of votes on that and how projects get set up. And so, just before we say give us a list, I want to see what their budget, what they're looking at, because it should be set up not based on what they can get from us, but what they can fund and what should be funded by their organization. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You know, I don't want us to.
Yeah, we have 3 votes out of 9.
Yeah, and so I think
their
it's.
board.
Okay. Ted, do you have enough direction or understanding?
Yeah, I think this was a good first step.
Okay.
I think what I'm hearing is there's more to do,
Yep.
both with WTA and looking at city projects, including the quiet zone. I will say to Jack's question, I think as we have the TIP discussion tonight, we could talk more about what we understand the total quiet zone cost to be, and they're not 100% reflected in the TIP, so we'll have that discussion tonight and give you a better input on that.
Okay. We'll now go to the third item, TBD project update.
So this is for information only, and I'll ask Chris to come down. As you recall, the TBD board approved, along with the city's biennial budget, approved a 2-year project list for TBD non-motorized, and we just wanted to provide a brief update on the timing of some projects that has shifted a little bit given some circumstances. So, Chris.
He's just practicing for tonight. That's all he's.
That's right. You'll hear it again tonight. Chris Como, Public Works. So, again, like Ted said, the TBD board had approved a list of projects in November of 2014, and we've been using that, working off that in the development of the draft TIP. So what's changed is we originally had looked at the intersection of 12th and Mill in Fairhaven as something that we might be able to move up to the 2015 project year, but the development that's helping to complement is not moving as quickly as we initially thought. It's still in the development review phase, so we're going to have to look at doing that in 2016. The timing actually works out really well for both the development and a new opportunity we've come across to potentially write a grant for the next intersection up at 11th and Finnegan. And both of those intersections are identified in the Fairhaven Urban Village Plan as needs. So we're taking a look at that. The other ones are St. Paul and Undine, and those are sidewalk projects, sidewalk on one side of each street, tying into both the Alabama project as well as the Texas Street Bike Boulevard project. Initially, we thought we might be able to get to these in 2016, but because of the extent of the reconstruction on Texas Street, it makes more sense to wait until 2017 for both the sidewalk on St. Paul and Undine as well. So that's the update that we have for you at this point. We'll mention it again tonight, but I just wanted to make sure you were aware of it as the TBD board.
Michael.
Chris, forgive me, I was slightly distracted by turning off the monitor. On the first delay you were talking about, recently the meeting Happy Valley Association, myself and Assistant Public Works Director, were talking all about the bike boulevard there. What is actually being delayed, the bike boulevard or just the intersection there at Mill and 12th?
So the bike boulevard from 12th to 24th is still on schedule for 2016, as is the intersection improvements at 24th and Mill,
The other end of
conjunction
that.
with the Happy Valley reconstruction, the school. But what we're saying is what we had intended to do in 2015 is realign the intersection at 12th and Mill in conjunction with some private development happening on the northeast corner. It looks like the developer's probably not going to be getting that wrapped up until spring 2016 anyway, so the timing works out really well. And if we're successful in getting the grant money for the other intersection, we could time these to be almost coincidental.
Okay, and if I recall correctly, that was the single priciest component of that whole project through Happy Valley, was that one intersection there?
Yeah, it's an intersection realignment, so it is spendy. But yeah, and remember, those are early estimates, and it doesn't include subtracting out what the private developer contribution is.
Jack.
So, Chris, with the delay of these 3 projects, are you interested in just encumbering this year's money for those projects later on, or are there other lists that are more shovel-ready that are on the priority list that could be done now, with the understanding that we would then supplant that money later on whenever these projects are ready?
We think it would make more sense to encumber the money and get through the design process, because there's quite a lot involved, especially with the intersection realignments. And then Texas is not currently funded, so we're going to have to find additional funding for that. But St. Paul and Undine, we need to make sure we reserve that money. It's very important to tie that together with the Texas Street Bike Boulevard.
Okay, and one last question is, it's not necessarily a large enough project, I think, for either for the TIP or for TBD or anything, but the wayfinding of all of the transportation network of greenways compared to our bike system, our bike master plan, and our pedestrian master plan. Are we doing any wayfinding this year as part of our overall effort?
Well, it's a really good question. Unfortunately, I don't have a specific answer for you. The answer is we're trying to establish a degree of connectivity before we dive into the wayfinding exercise. We actually took a stab at it last year, and it becomes incredibly complex very quickly. And so it's kind of a chicken and egg situation. You need to be able to provide some level of connectivity before you can really start directing people to facilities. And so we're going to go through an exercise. We'll have to probably bring somebody in to help us with that, somebody who's done it before. And we don't have a specific budget or project in mind at this point. We were hoping to get through some of this year's project to establish that initial degree of connectivity.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anything else? You know what I failed to do, and we usually had done this at the start of the TBD board. Is there anybody in the audience that wishes to make any comments to the board today? Public comment? Okay. Okay, if there isn't anything else to come before the board, the meeting is adjourned.
Do we have minutes?
Oh, I'm sorry. Approval of minutes.
Move approval of the minutes, which are dated March 23rd of 2015.
Second.
Motion been made and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries 7-0. We are now adjourned. We'll be back as the Bellingham City Council at 1 p.m.